Hello. In macroeconomics, there are two big questions. Why are some countries rich while others are poor? And why do all economies experience business cycles, recessions, and booming economies? Well, in economics, when we explore these two questions, we look at one statistic, real GDP. This diagram over here illustrates how real GDP tends to change over time. You notice that the real GDP goes up and down. That shows the business cycles. But there's also a growth trend, and that relates back to the first question. Right now, we're not trying to answer these two questions, but we do want to think about this statistic that they both use when they try to, in their answers. All right, so in order to calculate real GDP, we have to understand a couple of things. First of all, we have to be able to figure out what nominal GDP is. Nominal GDP is just the sum of the products between prices and quantities across all the markets within your economy. So here we can see that nominal GDP takes the equilibrium price and quantity in market A plus the equilibrium price and quantity in market B plus the equilibrium price and quantity in market C, and so forth across thousands of markets. And then that sum is going to give us a nominal GDP. The problem is that when you look at nominal GDP, you notice that nominal GDP can increase for two reasons. Either there's an increase in the output being produced, and that's a good thing, or nominal GDP can increase because there's an increase in prices. You have inflation. That is a bad thing. So how can we subtract out the effect of inflation while at the same time keep the impact of an increase in output? Because if we can produce more goods and services, we can also consume more goods and services, and that's a good thing. The way to do that is to look at real GDP. Okay, to remove the impact of inflation, real GDP keeps prices constant. And the way real GDP in the calculation achieves that is by using a price level from a base year. So whenever you calculate real GDP for a particular year, you always keep the prices exactly the same. So if you're going to do, if your base year is 2010 and you want to calculate real GDP for 2011, you will use the 2010 prices, but the 2011 quantities. All right. That way, you will have a measure that shows how quantities changes while keeping the prices exactly the same. All right, so this one removes the inflation. If you want to talk a little bit about inflation, we have another measure to do so. Actually, we have two measures to achieve that. Let's look at them real quick. All right, so if you want to check out inflation, because this is to see how much we have subtracted out when we calculate real GDP, there's two measures. One is the Gdp Deflator. The Gdp Deflator is just the ratio of the nominal GDP with the real, by the real GDP for a particular year. And what we have here then is that nominal GDP takes into account both the prices and the quantities. Real GDP keeps the prices constant and just look at the quantities changing. So the ratio will then focus on only the price change. So this would be a measure of inflation. Another way to measure inflation is taking the percentage change in the consumer price index, where the inflation rate is equal to the consumer price index in 1 year minus the consumer price index in a previous year divided by the previous year consumer price index. Now, the reason we want to do this is because the GDP deflator looks at prices across the entire economy. But when you look at a household, they only consume a subset of that universe of goods and services. So what we want to do is look at maybe what does a typical household consume. So we can create a basket of goods and services that most households will consume, something like that. And then we use that to calculate the consumer price index. And then once we have the CPI, we can calculate the rate of inflation as well. So this is the way we're going to be doing it. All right. So what we want to do now is just do a numerical example to explore all these concepts. Okay, here's our numerical example. We're going to look at 5 years, 2010 to 2014, we're going to look at 3 different kinds of goods. When you look at the Consumer Price Index, which is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they have several categories, but the 3 biggest ones are housing, transportation, and food and beverages. So we're just going to look at the top 3: housing, transportation, and food and beverages. So what we see here is, and I'm just making these numbers up here, here's the prices for housing, and these are the number of units of housing that are being produced and consumed in this economy. We have the price for transportation, the number of units of transportation being created and consumed, and the same for food and beverages, price and quantity. We're going to assume that the base year is 2010. We're going to look at a population of 100. And then later on, when we calculate the Consumer Price Index, we're going to have a basket. And the basket is going to consist of 1 unit of housing, 2 units of transportation, and 10 units of food and beverages. All right, so now we have all the numbers. Let's see if we can actually calculate nominal GDP, real GDP, the GDP deflator, maybe per capita GDP, real GDP per capita, as well as the rate of inflation. Okay, let's calculate nominal GDP for 2010. When you calculate nominal GDP, you use current prices and current quantities. So it will be equal to, this is how much the economy spends on housing. This is how much they spend on transportation. And that's how much they spend on food and beverages. You add these up and you get a nominal GDP for 2010 is 105,000. If we do the same thing for 2011, we can see that the price has now increased, but we still use current prices and current quantities. So here we have 1100 times 51, 250 times 101, and 31 times 1050. That is, we do all these numbers for 2011. And that is $113,900. That's the nominal GDP for this economy. Again, when we look at this number and we compare it to 2010, we can see it's higher. So it looks like nominal GDP has increased for sure. But we don't know exactly if it increased because quantities increased or if it increased because prices increased. Again, quantity increase is a good thing because that means we can consume more goods and services. Our standard of living has gone up. But a change in prices is not a good thing. That just means that everything is going to cost more. And that's not necessarily a good thing. So we could, of course, think about this some more. But the best way to approach this is to calculate real GDP. So 2 things. When you calculate real GDP for the base year, 2010, since the current price and the base year price is exactly the same, the real GDP for the base year will always be exactly the same as the nominal GDP for the base year. So we don't even have to calculate that. We can just write this in. 105,000. However, when we calculate real GDP, we have to be more careful. Now we must use the price from the base year, but the quantities from the current year. So the price from the base year is going to be 1,000, 250, and 30, but the quantities will be 51, 101, and 1,050. So real GDP for 2011 is then 1,000 times 51, 250 times 101, and 30 times 1,050, which is equal to 107,750. We see that Nominal GDP increased by 8,900. Real GDP increased by only 2,750. But the real GDP increase comes from only a change in quantities, whereas the change in nominal GDP comes from both a change in quantities and a change in price. So you can see that we're starting to tease out how prices have changed. There's actually a measure for that. So if we want to figure out how much prices have changed, we can find the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is calculated by taking the ratio between the nominal GDP and the real GDP. All right, here we have nominal for 2011 is 113,900. Real is 107,750, which means that the GDP deflator is equal to 1.057, although we usually multiply it by 100, so 105.7. That's our GDP deflator. As long as the GDP deflator is a number greater than 100, we have some inflation. That is, prices have increased in the total economy. All right, now we have calculated nominal GDP, real GDP, and the GDP deflator. Now we want to focus a little bit more on inflation. Remember, the GDP deflator shows that prices have increased, but it shows that all prices have increased. But we don't buy everything. Consumers buy a subset, so we need to look at a basket of goods and services that we tend to buy. And therefore, we have to learn more about the consumer price index, which is what we're going to do next. Okay, so if we want to calculate inflation in a more careful way, there are 5 steps we have to take. First, we have to fix the basket. This is going to be, what are the goods and services that goes into this basket that a typical household consumes. We have to be able to find the prices. We have them right over here, so we're going to be able to find them very easily. And then we're going to compute the cost of this basket in both the current year and in the base year. Once you have the cost of the basket in those 2 years, you can compute the consumer price index, CPI. And what you do then is simply take the cost of the basket in the current year and divide it by the cost of the basket in the base year. Once you have the CPI for more than 1 year, you can compute the inflation rate. So if you have it for, say, 2011, CPI for 2011, and then you subtract out the CPI for 2010, and you divide the CPI for 2010, then you're going to have the inflation rate between 2010 and 2011. Now, it's going to be very easy because the consumer price index for the base year is always equal to 100. And that is, of course, obvious from our, when you have the cost of the basket in the current year and the base year, but in 2010, the current year is the base year, so the cost of the basket is going to be exactly the same. So therefore, when you divide those two, you're going to get the number 1 or 100, if you will. All right, so let's just apply these 5 steps to the numbers that we have right up here. All right, so now we're going to calculate the rate of inflation between 2010 and 2011. So the first of all, we have to fix the basket. We had already done that, so it says here the basket is equal to 1 unit of housing, 2 units of transportation, and 10 units of food and beverages. We can look up the prices. So we're going to have it in both 2010 and 2011. So the prices in 2010, 1,250 and 30. That's what I wrote there. And then the prices in 2011, 1,100, 250 and 31. Wrote that over here. Okay, now we have what the basket consists of. We have the prices of all these goods. So we can just calculate the cost of the basket. The cost of the basket in the base year is simply the price multiplied by the quantity in the basket. And if I do that for all 3 goods, the cost of the basket is $1,800. Doing the same thing for 2011, we have 1,100, 250 and 31 multiplied by the units, 1, 2, and 10 in the basket. And that's equal to 1,910. All right, once we have the cost of the basket in the current year and in the base year, we can calculate the consumer price index. You recall that the consumer price index is the ratio between the cost of the basket in the current year divided by the cost of the basket in the base year, and 1910 divided by 1800 is equal to 1.061 or 106.1. So the consumer price index is equal to 1.061, or if you like to multiply everything by 100, 106.1. Once you have the consumer price index, we're ready to actually calculate the rate of inflation. I already told you that because 2010 is the base year, we know that the CPI for the base year is always equal to 100, so we can calculate the rate of inflation right now without actually calculating another CPI. Of course, if you were going to do the rate of inflation between 2011 and 2012, you would have to calculate the CPI for 2012 before you can do that. But here, we can go ahead and just do it. So 106.1 minus 100 divided by 100, 0.061 or 6.1%. So here we have, in this example, that the rate of inflation between 2010 and 2011 was 6.1%. Obviously, I gave you a lot of numbers over here, and I recommend that you calculate nominal GDP, real GDP per capita, that's just taking real GDP and divided by the number of people, as well as the Gdp deflator and the rate of inflation between all these years. So you have a lot of numbers that you can practice this on, and I encourage you to do so. Thank you.